Now, Joe Biden's dismal poll numbers continue to worsen as the crises mount and more voters sour on his job performance. A new Issues and Insight poll released today found that only 19% of voters surveyed chose Biden as their preferred Democratic nominee in 2024. By the way, that put him nearly 10 points behind. I'm not sure. Meanwhile, more recent studies and surveys show that he's losing ground with key demographics that helped elect him in the first place, particularly suburban voters. One NPR poll conducted in February found Biden's approval among suburban voters dropped from over 10 points from the end of 2021, a 12-point drop among suburban women. His approval with young voters, one of his strongest groups in the 2020 election, that's a mystery to me, now sits at a mere 41%. And despite the abysmal poll numbers, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain took a pretty bizarre victory lap after the French President Macron's reelection this weekend, despite Macron's 36% approval rating, seemingly implying that Biden can win in 2024 with the Quinnipiac poll of 33%. Anyway, here with reaction, outnumbered co-host Kayleigh McEnany and the author of the soon-to-be-released Suppression, Deception, Snobbery, and Bias, Why the Press Gets So Much Wrong and Just Does Not Care. By the way, you can get a first edition copy on Amazon.com or Hannity.com. Fox News contributor Ari Fleischer is with us. Kayleigh, let me start with you. It's every demographic. Independents, he's down to 26%. Hispanic Americans, he's down to 26%. He's down with suburban voters, African Americans, the youth vote, every single demographic. He's down dramatically. And I'm looking at the policies he's putting in place, and I don't see any movement at all towards making the adjustments that one might make if they want to turn things around.
No, in fact, he's taking the advice of Senator Warren, who said he needs to double down on these progressive policies and make good on them. That is not the answer, Sean. But the reason he's doing this, this kind of olive branch on student loans, the rolling back of Title 42, there was some reporting that, oh, maybe he's not going to roll it back. He always was, because here's the problem, Sean. He's losing that AOC wing of the party. He has to keep them. So he doesn't have time to try to salvage those independent suburban moms, because what he's having to do is appease the radical left. And Sean, I just have to say that chief of staff tweet, he's severely delusional, but those are the kinds of things that Joe Biden is hearing in the Oval Office. His advisors, his minions are coming to him. You're doing great. Don't listen to what they're saying out on cable news. You're winning, Mr. President. He's in an echo chamber of bliss and euphoria that simply does not exist.
Let me read this, Ari Fleischer. You're a great communicator. You know Mark Penn, well-respected Democratic pollster. He said, these economic blows are not just one element in a cascading set of problems all hitting at the same time. It combines the nuclear anxieties of the 50s and 60s with the inflation threat of the 70s, the crime wave of the 80s and 90s, and the tensions over illegal immigration in the 2000s and beyond. Then he says this electorate is not experiencing a malaise, as President Jimmy Carter once said to have proclaimed, but has instead formed a deep national fissure ready to blow like a geyser in the next election if the leadership does not move to relieve the pressure. Now, that's a Democratic pollster. That's a pretty deep, profound prediction on his part, and I agree with every word of it.
Well, it's also just very in touch, isn't it, with the man on the street, the woman on the street, the people for all these years now who are just fed up with everything that's going on, where nothing's going better. And then Joe Biden came along and made all these promises and has bumbled and fumbled his way through everything. Look, let me break down the Biden numbers in two different ways. For 2022, the midterm election, nothing's going to change it. The historical tide against parties in the first term of a presidency, combined with all of Biden's problems and the nation's problems, it's already the kiss of death for the Democrats. For 2024, history tells us that presidents who lose and get clobbered in the midterm can come back, as Bill Clinton did and as Barack Obama did. But Joe Biden can't. And the reason, Sean, I say that with such assurance is the Democrat Party is not going to want an 80-year-old in decline to lead the party, particularly after they lose the House, after they lose the Senate, and when he's so unpopular. Even if things turn around in 2 years and the economy seems to get strong, things change, Joe Biden will not be at the helm of the Democratic Party. It just will not happen.
Okay, so if you look at the Washington Post last week, Kayleigh, they had Joe Biden won if he runs again as the lead. Then they put Pete Buttigieg, interestingly, ahead of Kamala Harris. He was 2, she was 3. And then a list of people that I don't think inspire confidence in anybody. But I think that the one thing that makes Ari's prediction correct more than any other one thing is the fact that they're incapable of giving into their radical base and saying something like Bill Clinton said, the era of big government is over, or the end of welfare as we know it. That doesn't exist within this radical party.
No, that's a bygone era. Even President Obama knew what was good for himself at some points. Disagree with him entirely. However, on at least some issues, he knew that he needed to track a little bit toward the middle. That is gone, though. You're exactly right, though. When you look at that tracker, it is interesting, Sean. There's reporting that in the West Wing, there are whispers, Kamala's done. Pete Buttigieg is the new person we're looking to. But what I'm interested in is that poll that you put up, Sean, that not sure is more popular than Joe Biden. It's Joe Biden, then Kamala, then not sure. There is no bench in this party, Sean. You look at the Republican Party, you have our standard bearer, President Trump, but you've also got a huge, deep bench of people from Tim Scott to Ron DeSantis. It's exciting. Kristi Noem, you've got so many great people. They've got not sure. That's who they have.
Yeah. Now, let's say if Donald Trump decided to run, I would argue, Ari Fleischer, that every single day, with every failed policy and every bad decision Joe Biden makes, that he's handing the keys back to Donald Trump. If I was Donald Trump, I'd almost play like Joe Biden. I would do my rallies. I would do interviews with non-hostile, with non-hostile media. Why get in a fight with media that hates your guts? It doesn't seem to matter. I would prosecute the case against Joe, how bad his policies are, remind people what he did, and tell people how he's going to get us out of the mess that Joe created, and say, God bless you, God bless America, good night.
Well, I think we should also bear in mind how successful America was under President Trump's policies, particularly for child poverty rates, for the unemployment rates, for blacks, for Hispanics. So many of the economic indicators people have talked about for years to help people from the bottom rise up were all kicking into high gear under Donald Trump, and then COVID hit. That's a huge success story. Now, the issue the Democrats, of course, will have against Donald Trump is they love to hate him. And so do they get a boost in turnout if Donald Trump is the candidate beyond what they would get against any other candidate? But I don't think it matters for Joe Biden. None of that plays into it. I think that Joe Biden it's inevitable, Sean, in early 2023, shortly after the midterm shellacking, Joe Biden is going to succumb to the pressure that will build up inside the Democratic Party and announce he's not running for re-election. Democrats will be chomping at the bit to get out of the starting gates right after the November election, which is just 6 months from now, just a little over 6 months from now. This is going to be upon us real soon.
I agree with you. I'm not even sure, and polls even indicate most people are not sure that he's going to finish his first term. The idea of a second term, I'm just not buying it. Ari, looking forward to your book. Thank you. Great to see you. Kayleigh, always good to have you. Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.